Okay, so good afternoon, good morning. I'm here with Dr. Paul Clayton to discuss inflammation and my personal journey with inflammation. Today's date is, I believe, the 6th of January, 2023. Good morning, Paul. I believe you're over in America, is that correct?
I am down in a fish tank, as you can see, but on the eastern seaboard of the United States.
Brilliant, excellent. So thanks again in advance for your time. This is now the second edition or second time I've got the chance to have your advice and views, which is very much appreciated. So I'd like to discuss a few subjects with you today on this Zoom call, and the purpose of this is to be able to put this information to as many people that I can personally, in the hope to help them and provide some professional opinion from people like myself that are suffering from inflammation, whether it be rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, psoriasis, or any of the other autoimmune diseases that I personally am trying to get the information to and about. So one of the things I'd like to discuss today is what is called the Trondheim blood test. Now, I believe this is a blood lipid profile test, and it tests for the 11 essential fatty acids. It acts as a health check, and that allows you to be able to interpret the readings and find out what's going on from a cellular level with regards to inflammation. Now, that's me in layman's terms. Obviously, you're scientifically and medically trained. So could you put it to myself in a way that I can understand what this blood test does and how it can help me, please?
Well, we're measuring the levels and percentages of 11 fatty acids in the blood. And the first thing I want to say to you might sound a little counterintuitive, but that is, don't get too hung up on all the numbers. There are no absolutes. Humans don't operate like machinery. We don't operate on the basis of binary logic. We run on fuzzy logic. So a lot of these parameters can shift one way and then the other without creating too many problems. And we have all kinds of buffering systems in us which allow us to compensate for changes in diet, changes in the world around us, changes in levels of physical activity. If we weren't very heavily buffered, we probably would not be able to survive in a world that is full of stresses and dynamic change. Having said that, probably out of all the fatty acids that we do routinely measure, the most important algorithm that we derive from this that seems to have the most practical and predictive value is the 6:3 ratio. So here we're looking at the ratio of three fatty acids in particular. So arachidonic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid, and DHA and EPA, which are the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. Now, what we do know is constantly responding to stresses from the outside world, some of them from the inside world as well. And one of the ways in which your body responds to various types of stresses, whether it's a bacterium, a microbe that's got into the wrong place, or physical stress and trauma, is you mount an inflammatory response. And the inflammatory response is designed to neutralize the threat, if we're talking about a microbe, or it's designed to remove tissue that's been damaged after trauma. And the omega-6 fatty acid, arachidonic acid, is centrally involved in this aspect of our defense system. What happens is you have an enzyme called phospholipase A2 that comes along, and it starts to act on structural components in your cell membranes called phosphatidyl phospholipids. Your cell membrane contains very large amounts of these compounds. In fact, it's primarily consisted of these compounds. So along comes PLA2, it starts to chop up fatty acids in the membrane, and it's going to chop up both the omega-6s and omega-3s and various other fatty acids too. So the metabolites that it forms are going to be proportional to the amounts of the 6s and 3s in your membranes, in your cell membranes, and that they're proportional to the 6s and 3s in your diet to a large extent. So if you have roughly the right ratio of these fatty acids in your diet, and then the right fat, the ratio of these fatty acids in your cell membranes, when PLA2 comes along and starts to break these phospholipids down, is producing the right amounts of the omega-6 derived messengers, which is starting the inflammation cycle, but it's also producing the right amount of omega-3s to stop that inflammation once the inflammation has done what it's supposed to do. That is, kill off or ward off the microbe, if that's what the original insult is, or resolve or remove the amount of tissue damage if it was trauma, was the initial response. So an acute inflammatory response, switching it on and then off once the threat has been alleviated, that's absolutely part and parcel of a normal, healthy life. And you're doing this like hundreds of times a day, maybe thousands for all I know. Now the problems start to arise if you're eating a modern industrial type diet with lots of ultra processed foods, because when you look at the way in which dietary patterns have changed over the last 100 years, we see that two of the components which have increased more than anything else are the short chain omega-6 fatty acids from plant oils and simple sugars. And what that has done is created a climate or an environment in the body where you're loaded up with these omega-6s, the omega-6s from plant oils, and you're producing these pro-inflammatory mediators, and there's not enough of the omega-3s in your cell membrane. So the accelerator is jammed to the floor. You're driving the inflammatory sequence all the time, and you're not using the brake enough. So the inflammatory sequence, instead of being switched on, responding to the threat, neutralizing it, and then stopping and allowing things to go back to a healthy resting configuration, it continues with you, as I said, with your foot on the gas pedal. You're driving inflammatory stress, and this in time leads to the disorganization and then the destruction of healthy tissue. So the 6:3 ratio that we're measuring in the blood test, which, as I said, is a reflection of the 6:3 ratio in your diet, is giving us a kind of a window into your internal environment, your metabolism. And it's telling us, are you someone who's got really too many of the compounds that are leading to inflammation, or do you have the right amounts of both? So you can switch it on and off when you need to. What we find in the real world is because our diet has changed so much away from the foods that we co-evolved with, a more natural diet and lifestyle, where you would have been consuming very, very different foods from the types of prepackaged, pre-processed, ultra-processed foods that we consume now. We see, in public health terms, an explosion of chronic degenerative diseases, things like heart disease and hypertension, cancers, depression, autoimmune diseases, and allergies. And we know that each of them has a strong inflammatory component. So on the one hand, diet is feeding us more of these omega-6s. In public health terms, we're seeing much more inflammation. And it's not a huge intellectual leap to start to tie those two together. Now, that is not proof. That's just an association. But the reason why we think the blood test is so important is that when we find people who've got these very high 6:3 ratios, and we then introduce a combination of the omega-3 highly unsaturated fatty acids from fish oil, but chaperone with these very special polyphenols from olive oil, over time, over a period of several weeks and months, we can demonstrate that the 6:3 levels in capillary blood samples are dropping. And as they drop, the intensity of their inflammatory symptoms also starts to fall. So there's a very nice match here between changes in biochemistry and changes in symptom scores. It all ties together really well. And at this point, you, I think, can begin to say, yes, this is actually establishing proof of concept. And we've done this. We've seen this now in hundreds of thousands of subjects. In many cases, these are people who had inflammatory conditions ranging all the way from essential hypertension to arthritic disorders, and they had been pharmaceutically dependent for many, many years, for decades, What we find is that as their inflammatory stress falls, as their 6-to-3 ratio falls, they become less pharmaceutically dependent. They require less medication. And in many cases, what we see is that they become pharmaceutically independent. That is, they no longer require medical intervention at all. They're able to live drug-free lives. I'm not saying that this is the answer or a comprehensive alternative to pharmaceuticals. They will always be necessary. They, of course, they have a very important role in medicine. And I'm not one of those people who says, well, it's all about nutrition and you don't need what they call allopathy, which is a rather insulting term. To me, it's all pharmacology. You have synthetic pharmacology, which is extremely good at the rapid reduction in intensity of symptoms, and that's what we use it for. And then you have natural pharmacology or pharmaconutrition, which we can use in a rather more profound way to remedy some of the metabolic and biochemical problems that are causing those symptoms in the first place. So actually, these are not alternative types of medicine. They can and should be used in a genuinely integrational manner.
Okay. So you would advise, or I assume you would advise, I certainly would from my experience, to perform a Trondheim blood test, a dry blood test. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You put 3 spots of blood onto a card, and then you post it off to an independent lab. I believe it's Vitas in Norway. Are they the world's largest independent blood lab? Is that correct?
There's certainly one of them. Vitas was a spin-off originally from the University of Oslo, and they have impeccable credentials. Their client list, a lot of the multinational blue chip companies use them, and the WHO, although unfortunately I have to say that's not the seal of approval that it once was. But my point is that this is a first rank and totally independent analytical service who show no favor whatsoever to any clients. Their reputation is on the line with every test that they do, and they maintain extremely high standards.
Perfect. So just for clarity, for the benefit of anyone watching this video, you perform it comes in, the whole package comes to you, you perform a pinprick in one of your fingers, you put 3 drops of blood on, post it off to Vitas, register the test online, and then some weeks later, 2 or 3 weeks later, you'll get the results, and it will measure your 11 essential fatty acids and, importantly, your 3-to-6 ratio, which will then give you a baseline as to where you're at a cellular level before you can then work on some recommendations to improve the inflammatory markers that are within your cells. Is that fair synopsis?
Yes, it is. It's not a perfect test, but I think it's a very useful one. And it's not the only test that I would necessarily want to use with any particular patient, but it is extremely valuable. And can I just say that Zinzino has no access to this whatsoever. This is a private and direct negotiation, if you will, between the user of the test and Vitas. We can't access it at all unless you wish to share it with us. And that's how it should be.
So it's completely independent. Okay, perfect. So step 1 would be to get this test, which is what I done. Another subject I'd like to cover during this video, if possible, is as per my last video, I suffer from inflammation, done a lot of research, as many people do when they're in pain, suffering, come across fasting, time-restricted eating as something that could help me, and I believe has helped me with my condition. Could you explain to me from sort of a scientific point of view the benefits of fasting or time-restricted eating on inflammation, and what you would recommend yourself to someone like me?
Fasting has been shown to reduce inflammatory markers, at least in some conditions. And I think that even though we're not quite sure exactly how this operates, or at least I'm not, I think some of it is to do with the fact that you are not experiencing surges in blood glucose levels and blood insulin levels. You're also not, when you eat a meal, this is regarded as a stress by the body, and there's also a corticosteroid response. So this is a series of metabolic and endocrine responses which do seem and particularly if you have a high 6-to-3 ratio as well, to be potentially pro-inflammatory. And we know that fasting or intermittent fasting has been associated with quite a number of positive outcomes, at least in preclinical models. Very recently, a study has come out saying that people who do intermittent fasting don't necessarily live longer or healthier than anybody else. But there's a catch here. Humans, our lives consist of so many different variables, because if you do intermittent fasting and then in that window when you can eat, you eat a whole lot of rubbish, well, you're not necessarily going to come out better for that. If when you in that window, if you're consuming large amounts of ultra processed foods, which have been associated with a wide range of negative outcomes, that's going to undo many of the biochemical benefits and clinical endpoints that we have seen associated with intermittent fasting, as I said, both in preclinical models and in some fairly carefully controlled clinical trials as well. I think I don't like to say things like I'm a fan of intermittent fasting. I'm not really a fan of anything. I'm skeptical about everything until it gets to the point where the data really is overwhelmingly proving it. But there's quite a lot of information that suggests that intermittent fasting can be helpful in helping to bring metabolic disorders under control. And there's also some rather good evidence showing that it is chemoprotective. So I think in general, intermittent fasting is a good idea, but it has to be part of a healthy lifestyle. So that, as I said, in that window when you are eating, you're not loading up on plant oils and simple sugars.
So as part of a balanced approach, my fasting tends to revolve around sort of a 16 to 18 hour window without eating. And when I do eat, I try to eat plant-based and whole food, to certainly stay away from sort of fast food and anything like that if I can.
Well, I just want to get away from the idea that all fast food is bad, because I think that's a bit of an overgeneralization. I mean, if your fast food is a salad, or there's some chains, for example, in America here, one of the big chains is Chipotle. I'm not here to advertise Chipotle, but if you look at what they're putting into their fast foods, it's actually not too bad. There are other chains, and I could name a few, and I'm sure you know the ones I'm referring to, where the fast food that they're selling is actually not very well configured from a nutritional perspective at all. So not all fast is good, and not all basic produce is necessarily particularly good for you either. You have to be a little bit selective. You have to pick and choose. But I think if you're doing this kind of fasting schedule and the foods that you are eating are predominantly plant-based, I mean, we have to exclude probably French fries. That's not necessarily, that's plant-based, but it's not necessarily the best thing for you. Then I think you're doing a lot of the right things. I want to also make a plea for some of the really basic things, like, you don't smoke, you don't drink to excess, and that includes Guinness, and you take a certain amount of physical exercise. We were made to move. Humans evolved in an evolutionary crucible, which involved a great deal of movement. We've moved towards an extremely sedentary lifestyle. Technology has made that possible, but that's really not good for us. It isn't. We know that baseline levels of physical activity are really important in reducing the risk of a number of cancers, for example, but they're also involved in helping you to maintain a healthy body weight. And they have lots of other metabolic and clinical endpoint benefits as well. So it's not all about fasting and eating the right foods, a little bit more to living a healthy lifestyle than that.
Yes, it's sort of one factor of an overview of lifestyle changes or lifestyle implementations that somebody needs to make in order to help overcome or reduce the effects of inflammation.
Indeed. And chronic psychological stress is a killer as well. So there is, I think, a strong case to be made for trying to manage those aspects of your life as well. And if you're in a job, let's say, or in a relationship which is exposing you to very high levels of chronic stress, that's a pretty deleterious factor as well. So if that's something that you can act to change, that's something you should look at. There are one or two other tools that you can use if you're in a job or a situation or a relationship that you can't either leave or modify. There are various xenohormetic compounds derived typically from the world of herbology or herbalism, which I think have a role to play here as well.
Okay, perfect. So you touched upon in the last sort of conversation we just had, alcohol. So that was the next thing I want to discuss. I've just come back from a Spence New Year in Dublin. Probably drank one or two too many Guinnesses, and I've come home to a flare up. Right, Achilles is particularly tight and sore on my left knee, swollen up. So it's absolutely an inflammatory flare up, which I'm suffering. Prior to this, I'd sort of had 2 or 3 months of being flare up free, pain free, which was the first time in a while that had been the case. So I'm attributing this flare up to maybe, I don't know, I'm not going to put a number on it, but excess Guinness and alcohol potentially. I mean, would that be fair to say that alcohol negatively affects inflammation?
Well, first of all, I'm not quite sure that this concept of too much Guinness is quite hard for me to wrap my head around, particularly if you're in Dublin and you're drinking the Dublin Guinness. There's nothing like it. Yes, but if you're taking a lot of alcohol on board, that probably is going to exert an inflammatory effect, as you've noticed yourself. And I've heard other people say exactly the same thing. So I'm not going to ask you any embarrassing questions. I mean, how many extra pints you did have. But I think that you're looking at your identification of the cause and the effect here. I think you're spot on. But another thing, I mean, if you were taking in lots of extra calories and drinking lots of Guinness, and Guinness is quite calorific, maybe there were other things that you weren't eating that you would normally eat. Maybe you were cutting down on some of the anti-inflammatory compounds that you would be eating in an otherwise healthy diet. So you were sort of accentuating the negative here, reducing the positive. You were sort of burning the candle from both ends, perhaps. And I think that's maybe a slightly better explanation of why you went into these flare-ups.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that potentially my inflammation flare-up sort of triggers are so finely balanced that just 2 or 3 days of doing the wrong things for me can result in a flare-up, which has lasted 2 or 3 days now, potentially could last a week or more.
But here's the interesting thing. Those flare-ups are acting like a canary in the coal mine. They're telling you. They're giving you a warning of what's going on, so you can then take remedial action. For many people, they're not getting those signs, and so they go on in their merry way with chronic inflammatory stress burning away in the background. And the first warning they get is, let's say, a heart attack. Yeah. So you're, in a way, yep, you are walking a bit more of a tightrope than many people are. But think of it in a positive sense. You're actually getting an early warning, which most people don't have, and that leaves them vulnerable in a way that you're not.
Okay, so let's ask a question on behalf of somebody. Obviously, my condition is mild compared to some others. I'm in some sort of groups online on social media sites and so on, and some people are in horrific, life-changing pain, and that's potentially for the rest of their lives. I see the cries for help. Some people just want someone to talk to. That it seems that even getting dressed can take some people a length of time, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and they're in chronic, severe pain. And I hope I never find myself in that position. My father was somewhat similar to that, hence my quest for trying to help some people, as many people as I can. What would your advice be to somebody who's had this a condition, whether it be arthritis or something similar, for a long period of time? It's easy for them to watch this video and go, okay, well, Dan looks quite fit and healthy, and he's sort of only on a cycle where he's having a flare up, and what would you say to them? What the steps they could implement to help themselves come out of pain and to somewhere near what a normal lifestyle would be like in terms of pain and mobility?
First of all, they have my profound sympathy, because I know from personal experience just how disabling this kind of chronic severe pain is. I was at one point in my life, probably about 15 years ago now, quite a long time, diagnosed with osteoarthritis of the hip. And this was something that had run in my family. My mother had an artificial hip. My grandmother had an artificial hip. And I was actually beginning to think, well, God, am I having to go into this type of surgery? Is that, am I going to be limping in their footsteps? And around about that time, I started looking at inflammatory stress and its management very seriously. And I started using balance oil or precursors to balance oil. And whereas I had previously been unable to sit in a car and drive for more than 20 or 30 minutes at a time, and if I'd been getting in and out of a tube train in London, because I was living in London at that time, I had to make sure that I always went with my left foot forwards. I couldn't put my right foot down on the ground. I couldn't bear any weight in it. I couldn't sleep on my right side. And I think this is a pattern that some of your listeners will be familiar with. And I just felt terrible about myself. I felt this is the end of my life. My body's breaking down, and surgery is the only prospect. And I really didn't feel that I wanted to go that way at all. So now I changed various aspects of my lifestyle. I moved towards an anti-inflammatory lifestyle, and I started using this sort of early version of balance oil. And I can tell you what I was hoping for. What I knew even then was that cartilage, and indeed any other tissue, any other living tissue, is dynamic. It's constantly being broken down or replaced. And I thought, if I can slow down the breakdown aspect of it long enough, maybe I can move out of pain, and maybe over time the joint will reconstruct itself. Now, this was osteoarthritis, not rheumatoid. It's a different situation. And very slowly, because cartilage is a slowly turning up tissue, I became aware that the pain was receding, that I was able to sit in place instead of 20 or 30 minutes for a couple of hours at a time. And I'm now 10 years further down the road in a place where I can run again. I can walk. I used to run, in my earlier life, 60 miles a week, 10 miles an hour, 3 times a week. I'm way too old for that now, but I can do 5 miles an hour. Hard walking and mixed running, and I do that 3 or 4 times a week. I have no more pain at all. It's completely gone. So that was a situation where chronic inflammatory stress was making my life miserable. It was overshadowing my daily life with pain, and I couldn't sleep properly either. So it meant in the night I couldn't sleep, but I was awake and stressed. During the day I was too sleepy and unproductive. It's, I think, a cycle that many of your listeners will be familiar with. All of that's gone. I was lucky in the sense that I was able to intervene with this process at an early stage, and at a point where there was still enough cartilage in there. Once the inflammatory stress had been removed, and I was giving the cartilage cells, the chondroblasts, what they needed, the chondrocytes, to create more cartilage, I was able to give this time and for the cell repair to take place. If you leave this to a point where there's no cartilage left, I don't think this approach is going to be effective at all. And so for people who are in the category of patients that you're talking about, if we can get to them early enough and switch off the inflammation effectively enough, and I don't mean using the drugs like methotrexate, azathioprine, or the new biologicals, because I really worry about the side effects and the toxicity problems associated with those, but using a very safe natural intervention such as omega-3s and polyphenols, then that is eventually going to be helpful. But this is something that doesn't work right away. For people who need to achieve pain relief more quickly because their lives are so disrupted, you need something that acts more quickly. The pharmaceuticals are helpful, at least in that respect, but there are some natural compounds that do have anti-inflammatory analgesic effects in the more short term. And probably of the different types of phytonutrients that work in this way, the polyphenols are the best characterized. We know quite a lot about their chemistry, how they actually work to switch off inflammation. Part of the problems associated with them, that many of them are not hugely bioavailable. The curcuminols, for example, do have quite well documented anti-inflammatory benefits, but low bioavailability. So you can go to the store, buy curcumin or turmeric powder capsules, and they're not going to do much for you. There are some variations now which are much more bioavailable. One of them is called hydrocurc, which is one of the forms that we sometimes use. And this achieves very respectable plasma levels very quickly after you've taken them either in capsule or tablet form. So this is a...
Sorry to interrupt, Paul. Could you just, if anyone wants to know what that's called, is it hydrocort?
Hydrocort is a corticosteroid. Hydrocurc, HYDROCURC. And this is produced by an Australian company who've done a really good job creating this technical formulation that gives you very high levels of the curcuminoids in your bloodstream. And it switches off inflammatory stress quite consistently and very rapidly, within the first hour or so after taking these. Unlike the more toxic anti-inflammatory drugs, yes, there are side effects, but they seem to be entirely positive. You're switching off inflammatory stress elsewhere. And so you will find if you have essential hypertension over time, that will start to decline as well. So you're going to feel a lot better with these.
Okay, thank you. So that brings us on to my next question, which would be, if you, obviously, I know you've written some books, which I'm in the process of reading now. In a sort of 5-minute snapshot, could you give us the perfect anti-inflammatory diet? Well, what would be good for myself if I was going to be your test subject in an anti-inflammation diet and I was going to follow it to the T? What would you suggest that I do in order to switch off the inflammation in my body?
Well, the Mediterranean diet is widely recognized as being a reasonably anti-inflammatory diet. And you see the end effects of this when you look at its ability to reduce the risks of many of the chronic degenerative diseases which have an inflammatory driver in them. So the Mediterranean diet would be a good place to start. And what that means is plenty of fruits and vegetables, olive oil and olives are an important part of that diet. Reduced intakes of plant oils other than olive oil, steer clear of ultra-processed foods. Fish rather than meat. Oily fish, if you can get it, that's actually not really part of the Mediterranean diet, but seafoods in general. And if you can go for the oily fish, such as herring, mackerel, sardines, menhaden, pilchards, they're a good source of these long-chain omega-3s. And they also, at the same time, contain the right polyphenols, which are the natural chaperones for these essential fatty acids. That would be a good place to start. And if you can't, if you're stuck in Liverpool or London and you can't find your way down to Larnaca and you can't directly access the Mediterranean diet, then as a rule of thumb, more fruits, more veg, less plant oils, less sugars and simple starches. And that would be your basic rule of thumb.
Perfect. So there'll be no need to sort of do away with any one particular food source. Things like red meat, would you, I mean, I personally try not to eat red meat. Would you say they could be inflammatory?
No, well, not necessarily. It gets a little bit complicated here. It depends on whether the animal is monogastric or not. Now, by that, if it has a single stomach, for example, pigs or chickens, then what they eat, if they're eating large amounts of, for example, soy and corn, and they're used, they're very important parts of the feedstock for these types of animals. You have a high 6-to-3 ratio in the feed. It gets into the stomach, it's digested. Those 6-to-3s in their food are incorporated into their cell membranes, and that meat will have a high 6-to-3 ratio. There are other animals, the ruminants, cows, goats, and sheep. Basically, they have a biofermenter at the front end of the gastrointestinal tract. So the food that the cow eats, whether it's got large amounts of 6s and 3s in it or not, those are all broken down by the microbes in its rumen. And they will break it down into very simple constituent parts, which the cow will then absorb. So it's not quite as affected by the high 6-to-3 food stock as the monogastric single stomach animals are. So if you're going to eat red meat, again, I'd say in moderation. Most people will tell you that in those so-called blue zones where you have large numbers of people living for longer, meat is generally not consumed in large amounts. So I'd say smaller amounts. And if you are going to, if you have a craving for red meat, beef is going to be better, generally a better choice than pork.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Another question. I was speaking with a friend of mine earlier today, and he suggested I ask you about saunas and ice therapy, and the effects of that on inflammation. Is that a good thing?
Well, these are stressors and the body responds by ramping up stress responses, which do have anti-inflammatory effects. And I've tried both of those: infrared saunas, ice, ice or ultra or cryotherapy, as I think it's called now. And in fact, I was doing that 3 decades ago, working with a man called Nick Gracie. And it's a little bit uncomfortable to start with, but your body acclimatizes. And after a certain point, you can sit in an ice bath and actually feel quite comfortable. Yes, it does seem to have anti-inflammatory effects. And a large part of that is mediated via the body's response to these stresses, whether it's heat or cold.
Okay, so is there a specific protocol that you would recommend, or is it not something that
You know what? I'm not really an expert in those. I just know roughly how they operate, but I tend to focus really more on nutrition. So I think you could probably find people who have far more expertise in those areas than I do.
Okay, thank you for your honest answer. Now the next question, which I'd like you to explain, is, now I believe it's yourself that's put together or overseen the health protocol, which can reduce inflammation by starting with the Trondheim blood test, the balance oil, the xenobiotic gut powder, the extend. If you could go into some detail on that, please, on how that can help people like me and other people who are suffering with inflammatory and autoimmune conditions.
Well, the health protocol is designed to be a kind of a nutritional time machine. When you start using the health protocol, it's designed to shift your nutritional profile and then your metabolic profile and then your health risks back in time by about a century or a century and a half. Because when you look at the way in which our diet has changed over the last 150 years, you can see that it has changed in a way that creates far more inflammation. So, for example, the 6-to-3 ratio has gone all the way up. Our microbiome has changed from being predominantly gram-positive to predominantly gram-negative. And our intake of a wide range of micro and phytonutrients has declined. So the health protocol is designed to remedy all those things. It's designed to restore a 6-to-3 ratio that is more typical of those that we saw, let's say, in the mid-Victorian period, which is one era that I've specialized in. It restores the microbiome to a configuration that you would have seen in that mid-Victorian period, and it restores what we believe are optimal levels of vitamins, trace elements, and a range of phytonutrients. What do we see when we go back 150 years? Well, when you look at the mid-Victorian era, you find a population that didn't really have much inflammatory disease at all. So, for example, we did a study where we looked at levels of coronary artery disease, heart attacks, strokes, and cancers. And yes, they do exist in that population, but at relatively low levels, about 10% of the levels that we see today. So I think that by restoring this metabolic environment inside you, putting it back, sending it back in time to that much earlier and much healthier era, you're then going to enjoy the same types of health benefits that they experienced. Now, I know that people feel they've heard or read somewhere that in the 19th century, life was brutish and short. Actually, that's not the case at all. When you dig into public health statistics of that time, in the period 1850 to 1900, what we call the mid-Victorian era, was probably one of the healthiest periods in British history that we know of. For a variety of reasons. They were physically very active. They were eating large amounts of fresh produce. They weren't eating, obviously, any ultra-processed foods whatsoever. And the end result of all that was they sort of lived about, almost to the same lifespan that we did. But what they tended to die of was either trauma or, in the majority of cases, overwhelming infection. And that was a time when society was repeatedly affected by epidemics of influenza, typhus, typhoid, and cholera, because you're talking about a time when, before adequate public sanitation, when people were living in very crowded conditions, very close together, and it was absolutely, the conditions were absolutely ideal for pathogens, which spread from person to person. And so what you find is that records of death at that time, people die very quickly and very often collectively in large numbers. Contrast that with the position today where we tend to die individually, but agonizingly slowly and very expensively. So this is not a cure for mortality, but what it is a way of reducing your risk of chronic degenerative disease. Now, we have the best of both worlds, because where the mid-Victorians were exposed to contaminated food and water, we're not. So our risk of infectious disease is reduced. And we also have antibiotics, some of which still work despite widespread misuse. So what we achieve by using the health protocol is we get the health benefits from the 19th century, and we can tack onto that as and when needed the pharmaceuticals that 20th and 21st century research make available to us. Now, I'll dial back a little bit. And I said, well, the Victorians they had roughly the same kind of a life expectancy as we do now, but they had a far greater health expectancy. So whereas we can expect to spend the last 10% of our lives approximately becoming progressively sicker with a chronic degenerative disease, becoming progressively more disabled and dependent and expensive, what the Victorian model shows us is that if you have the right nutrition, instead of dying slowly and expensively, you retain your physical, your psychological, your intellectual health right up until the end, and then pop your clogs pretty quickly. So as I said, it's not a recipe for eternal life, but I think it's a better way of living and a better way of dying than than society currently offers us.
Perfect. So could you just explain a little bit more of the specifics of the health protocol and each of the elements of that, with the biotic, xenobiotic, the balance oil, and the extend, and what each of them do individually and in unison?
Well, but the balance oil is designed to improve your fatty acid profile and reduce the 6:3 ratio from 15:1 would be the European average, and bring it down to below 5:1, where we know chronic inflammatory stress tends to fade away. So that's one thing. Xenobiotic is really important, and it acts in conjunction with balance oil because it's reducing inflammatory stress and resolving problems in another area of the body where balance oil can't go. And that is in the microbiome, specifically the microbiota that inhabit the large intestine. We used to eat a diet containing rather large amounts of a particular kind of dietary fiber, which is called fermentable fiber. Some people call it prebiotic fiber. And if you're eating lots of prebiotic fiber, which the mid-Victorians undoubtedly did because we know exactly what they ate, these fibers are food not for you exactly, but for the microbes that inhabit the large intestine. And if you're eating these fibers, they fuel the growth of a group of microbes which are gram-positive, which ferment or break down the fibers and produce short-chain fatty acids such as butyrate, which are very anti-inflammatory and very good at telling cancer cells stop, either killing them outright or telling them to behave. So if you're eating these fibers, the microbes in your gut are having a really nice conversation with the cells that line the intestine, and they're saying, don't be inflamed, don't be cancerous, behave normally. That's a healthy environment. By taking the fibers out of the diet, and these fibers hardly exist at all in many modern ultra-processed foods, the bacteria, the gram-positive bacteria, starve to their numbers decline, and their place is taken by other species, many of which are gram-negative. Not all bad, but if you have too many gram-negative bacteria in the lower bowel, they create inflammatory stress. First of all, they're not fermenting the prebiotics, they're not producing butyrate, so that anti-inflammatory protective nutrient has gone. They're loaded with something called lipopolysaccharide. That's what defines a gram-negative microbe. And many of these microbes, instead of using fibers as their preferred fuel, they actually eat proteins or amino acids and proteins. And what they do is they degrade the mucosa, the mucosal layer that lays over the cells that line the intestine. They come into direct contact with these cells, which we call colonocytes. And because they're loaded with lipopolysaccharide, which is very pro-inflammatory, now you have a problem, lots of chronic inflammation. Now the environment is a hostile. This is a microbiota, which is causing inflammation. It's actually encouraging and facilitating the development of cancer. And that's bad enough if that was all that was happening inside the intestines, but it's worse than that when you have chronic inflammatory stress. The tight junctions between the colonocytes start to open up. This is what people sometimes refer to as leaky gut. and you get LPS, lipopolysaccharide, moving into the bloodstream, a condition that we call endotoxemia, causing damage to the liver, the blood vessels, the brain, and a whole host of other organs, creating inflammatory stress that balanced oil isn't going to do so much about. So you need to switch that other component off, which we do with xenobiotic. It's specifically designed to restore a much earlier, a mid-Victorian type of microbial population in the gut. And that's going to resolve a lot of gastrointestinal problems, but it's also going to protect many other tissues in the body. In that sense, it acts conjointly with balanced oil. They complement each other. The third element is something called extend. Now, it's designed, it assumes that you're eating the modern diet, which leaves many people rather low in a range of vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients. I don't believe in megadoses of any of these things. I think you can potentially run into problems with at least some of them. So I don't advocate the huge doses that some people here in the United States do. What I think is a safer approach is to take into consideration what you're probably already eating if you take an average modern diet, and just raise the nutritional profile to the levels that we find in those so-called blue zones where people lead longer and healthier lives, and don't go above that. So it's a rather more subtle approach, I think, to improving your overall micro and phytonutrient profile. And this is important because many of these compounds are protective in different ways, but they're also cofactors in various healing processes that have to take place in the body for normal maintenance and sustained health. So these are the three pillars that are all acting very, distinctly in very different ways, but together they're designed to take your metabolism and push it back 150 years or so to a time when chronic degenerative disease was far rarer than it is today. There's one fourth element that I've designed as well, which is not available yet, but that's designed to rectify our reduced physical activity. And you go back to the mid-19th century, you see a culture that's predominantly blue collar, working with their backs and with their hands, burning a lot of calories, and that has lots of benefits in terms of overall health. It's chemoprotective, as I referred to earlier, so it protects against cancer, but it protects against lots of other things as well. I think it's really great if you are willing to go to the gym every day and work out every day, walk everywhere. And that's what I advocate. That's what I try to practice myself if I can. But for those who won't do that or can't, because let's say they're hemiplegic or paraplegic, or they have they have arthritic complications or neuropathies, then I think for people like that, there are exercise mimetics. This is what they're known as in research circles, which act in a way that is very similar to physical exercise, because they phosphorylate AMPK, which is known as the metabolic master switch. I'm not sure I like that term, but when you activate AMP kinase, it does produce many of the biological and biochemical effects of exercise. So it's a hack for people who can't or won't exercise. And it's designed to, again, restore levels of physical activity in a capsule in a way which are more like those that we would have been engaged in an earlier society, which wasn't as mechanized as ours is.
Sorry, what's that product called, and when will it be available?
The marketing people have decided to call it Inner Gym.
Inner Gym, okay.
Which I think is quite catchy. And we're not the first people to explore this. The Singapore government, for example, has elected to give, I think, every adult something called metformin, which is an anti-diabetic medication. Metformin acts in a rather similar way. It was actually originally a natural product extracted from Galega officinalis, which I think is known as the French lily, or it's got another name as well. It's got various names. And what it does is it acts indirectly to improve AMP kinase activity, and it's a form of exercise mimic. It's now been repositioned as an anti-aging compound, but it is a drug. You can't get it without a license. And it does have an unfortunate tendency to cause quite severe diarrhea in some folk. Not other people can tolerate it, but there's a significant number who can't. So I've been looking, as have many other people, for an alternative molecule from the plant kingdom, and there are several that have been identified. One that I like a lot is dihydroberberine, which is taken from the barberry, which is a fruit that's a berry that is consumed as a fruit in some countries and made into jams and preserves. And it's a non-licensed equivalent, if you like, to metformin. It'll help to bring your blood sugar down, and it's doing so because it's acting as an exercise mimic, and it'll help you to lose a little of that deep abdominal fat, and it'll help to improve your various metabolic parameters. Unlike crude berberine, and unlike metformin, it doesn't hang around inside the gut for very long, and so it doesn't seem to trigger gastrointestinal problems. It gets into the blood rather more quickly, does what it has to do, and having tried it myself, it doesn't seem to cause really any gastrointestinal problems at all. So I think that this is it's like a next generation exercise mimetic. Does it reproduce all of the effects of exercise? No, it doesn't. But it reproduces some of the physiological and biochemical benefits of exercise.
And would someone like myself, I mean, I try to get to the gym 4 or 5 times a week. Would somebody like myself use it additionally to the gym, or would it be either or?
No, you can use it in addition if you want. And what I found is that people who've primed themselves with this, when they do finally get around after they've made that New Year's resolution, they go to the gym and they do that first workout. And you must recognize this from your own experience. If you haven't done it for a long time, you feel okay in the gym. The next day you wake up and you're sore, you're in pain, and it's really demotivational, which is why, you know, you buy that exercise bicycle or rowing machine and you use it for the first day or so, the first day in January, and then you put it in the attic and you never see it again. But the point of using something like in a gym or dihydroberberine is that it kind of primes your muscles and gets them ready. So by, the next time you go out there, either onto the track or into the gym, the next day after that, you're not feeling this awful aching pain and stiffness, particularly if you've also been taking balance oil. So I could do a new exercise tomorrow, which I haven't done before, and really work at it. And then there's no, you get the gain and there's none of the pain. I mean, for me, I just wish I'd known about this half a century ago.
Enhances the recovery. I'd be very interested to try someone when it's available on the market. I'd be more than interested to give it a whirl.
Yeah, you should play with it. I think, find out for yourself what it does for you. But I know what it's done for me. And we know a lot of very high-flying athletes now who are using this. They're adding it to their training, and they're just seeing incremental changes in their personal bests.
Excellent. Well, I'll have a chat with Rebecca and see if she can point me in the right direction of where I can get some. Okay. Well, I think that concludes things for today. Thanks for your time, as ever, Paul. It's been very informative. As I say, my intention is to put this information, this recording of the video, out there to help as many people as we can, with your permission, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, well, as I say, thanks again, Paul, and hopefully we can catch up at some point in the future.
Dan, a pleasure to see you again. And if you want to come back to this, and if Viva can help to arrange this, I'd be happy to do that.
Thanks. Cheers. Much